There are people in this world who laugh at the idea that dreams matter. They say a dream is nothing more than electrical activity in the brain. A random replay of memories, a meaningless sequence of images, but anyone who has truly loved someone and then buried them knows it is not that simple. Because sometimes a dream reaches into the deepest part of the human soul in a way ordinary memories never can. A person can go months pretending they are strong, pretending they have accepted the loss, pretending they have moved on. And then one dream changes everything. Suddenly they see the face again, they hear the voice again. They feel the presence again, and the pain returns so intensely that it almost feels like the funeral happened yesterday. Why? Because the soul remembers what the mind tries to suppress. You see, modern society teaches people to escape grief instead of confronting it. People distract themselves with noise, entertainment, endless scrolling, endless movement, anything to avoid silence. Because silence forces the heart to speak, and the human heart is terrifying when it finally speaks honestly. Especially after loss, there are wounds buried so deeply inside people that they themselves do not realize they are carrying them. Regret, guilt, anger, unspoken love, unfinished conversations. Someone says, "I'm okay," but deep inside they are still replaying the last hospital visit, the last phone call, the last argument, the last moment they saw the person alive. And this is why dreams become so powerful. Because when the body sleeps, many of the defenses collapse, the distractions disappear, the masks fall away, and the soul begins revealing what has been hidden. I once heard about a man whose mother died after a long illness. For years he carried tremendous guilt because during the final months of her life he avoided visiting her as often as he should have. Not because he did not love her, but because he was afraid of watching her fade, afraid of helplessness, afraid of death itself. After she died, he buried those emotions under work and routine. He convinced himself life had simply moved on. But one night he dreamed he was sitting at the kitchen table from his childhood. His mother stood near the window smiling peacefully, and in the dream he kept repeating, I'm sorry I wasn't there enough." She simply looked at him and said, "I loved you before you failed." Then he woke up crying. Now people immediately want to ask, was that really his mother? Was it supernatural? Was it a message from heaven? But often those are the wrong questions. Because the greater truth is this: the dream exposed the wound hidden inside his soul, the guilt, the shame, the self-condemnation, and psychologically, this is extremely important to understand. Human beings were not created to carry unresolved grief forever. The soul seeks resolution, it seeks meaning, it seeks peace, and when those things are absent, they emerge through dreams, emotions, anxiety, and even physical exhaustion. Many people are not tired because of work. They are tired because of emotional weight they have never processed. There are people carrying conversations in their heads with dead relatives for 10 years, still arguing, still apologizing, still wishing for one more moment, and because they never surrendered the grief to God, the grief became part of their identity. That is what happens when sorrow is not purified. It begins consuming the person. The devil loves this, by the way. Because excessive attachment to grief can slowly become spiritually disordered. Now listen carefully. Loving someone deeply is not wrong. Mourning is not wrong. Even our Lord wept at the tomb of Lazarus. But there is a difference between holy sorrow and destructive attachment. Holy sorrow brings the soul closer to God. Destructive attachment traps the soul in obsession, despair, and emotional paralysis. There are people who stop truly living after someone dies. Part of them dies too. Their entire emotional world becomes chained to memory. They replay old voicemails constantly. They refuse to let themselves heal because healing feels like betrayal. They secretly believe moving forward means they did not truly love the person. But that is not love, that is emotional captivity. Real love desires eternity. Real love entrusts the beloved person to God. You cannot save the dead through anxiety. You cannot heal them through despair. You cannot honor them by destroying your own peace. What helps the dead most is prayer, sacrifice, masses offered for their soul, acts of charity done in love. Because death is not annihilation. The soul continues. And this is why dreams about the deceased affect people so deeply. The human soul instinctively knows life is more than material existence. Even people far from religion often feel this. Why? Because eternity is written into the human heart. No amount of atheism can fully erase it. No amount of distraction can completely silence it. Deep inside, people know love was never meant to end in a grave, and yet we must remain spiritually balanced. Not every dream is a message from God. Not every dream is supernatural. Some dreams are simply psychological processing. This is where discernment matters. People become spiritually unhealthy when they obsess over signs. They begin interpreting every coincidence as communication, every dream as prophecy, every emotion as mystical revelation. That leads to confusion very quickly. God is not the author of chaos. Most often, dreams involving deceased loved ones reveal something happening inside the dreamer. Perhaps unresolved grief, perhaps guilt, perhaps longing, perhaps fear of mortality, perhaps a need for forgiveness. And sometimes God permits the dream precisely because the soul has avoided healing for too long. There are people who appear emotionally functional on the outside while internally collapsing. And eventually the soul forces the issue, through dreams, through anxiety, through depression, through emotional breakdown. Because the human person cannot indefinitely suppress truth without consequences. Modern psychology observes this constantly. Suppressed pain does not disappear. It transforms, sometimes into anger, sometimes into addiction, sometimes into numbness, sometimes into chronic emptiness, and many people do not realize that underneath their exhaustion is unresolved grief from years ago. A father dies, a spouse dies, a child dies, and outwardly life continues, but inwardly something remains frozen in time. Then one night they dream of that person again, and suddenly the tears come that never came at the funeral. That is why these dreams feel sacred to many people, because for a brief moment the emotional walls collapse. The person stops performing strength, stops pretending, stops hiding, and the heart finally tells the truth. I still miss them. There is nothing weak about that. The world today fears vulnerability because it fears truth. People hide behind sarcasm, entertainment, noise, and superficiality, but grief strips away illusion. Death reveals what truly matters. No one on their deathbed wishes they spent more time scrolling on a phone. No one wishes they worried more about appearances. No one wishes they loved less deeply. And when someone dead appears in a dream, often the soul is being reminded of that reality. Life is short, time is fragile, relationships matter, and eternity is approaching faster than people realize. That realization can either awaken wisdom or deepen despair. Which path a person chooses depends on whether they surrender the grief to God. Without God, grief becomes hopelessness. With God, grief becomes purification. Pain can harden the soul or sanctify it. And many people discover during mourning that they were far more spiritually weak than they imagined. Because death destroys the illusion of control, you suddenly realize you cannot stop time, you cannot stop suffering. You cannot stop mortality, and modern culture hates that truth. It constantly promises control, comfort, pleasure, distraction. But death enters every life eventually and shatters the fantasy. That is why dreams of the deceased often leave people shaken for days. The dream reminds them that eternity is real, that love is real, that loss is real, and deep inside the soul begins asking questions the modern world cannot answer. What happens after death? Where are they now? Will I see them again? Did I love them enough? Am I living correctly? These are not childish questions. These are the deepest questions of human existence, and sometimes one dream opens the door to all of them. So if you dream of someone who passed away, do not immediately run toward fear or superstition. Instead, become still. Pray, examine your heart honestly. Ask yourself, what inside me still needs healing? What have I refused to face? What sorrow have I buried? What guilt have I carried? What must I surrender to God? Because sometimes the dream is not really about the dead. Sometimes it is about the living. Sometimes it is about the wounded parts of your soul crying out for truth, healing, forgiveness, and peace. And perhaps the greatest mistake people make is believing grief means weakness. No, grief reveals love. And love always leaves an imprint on the soul. There is something deeply unsettling about dreaming of someone who has died. Not merely emotional, not merely psychological, something deeper. Because, whether people admit it or not, death confronts every human being with the reality they spend most of their lives trying to avoid. Eternity. Modern culture trains people to live as if death does not exist. Stay entertained, stay distracted. Stay busy, keep consuming, keep scrolling, keep chasing pleasure, and above all, never become silent long enough to think about where your soul is going. That is why dreams involving the dead can shake a person so powerfully, because suddenly, for one brief moment, eternity breaks through the noise. A person who died years ago appears vividly before you. Their face is clear. Their voice feels real. Their presence feels undeniable, and when you wake up, something inside you feels disturbed, not always because of fear, but because the dream awakened something your conscience had buried. You see, conscience is not merely a feeling. It is the interior voice that recognizes truth, and one of the most terrifying truths the conscience recognizes is this: your life is temporary. Every single person listening to this right now will die. Every celebrity, every politician, every wealthy businessman, every influencer, every athlete, every one of them will stand before God stripped of titles, followers, money, and image. And deep down the soul knows this. That is why dreams of deceased loved ones often come during moments of spiritual emptiness. A man drifts away from prayer for years. A woman becomes consumed by material success. Someone becomes trapped in addiction, lust, bitterness, or pride. Then, suddenly, they dream of a dead relative. Why? Because death carries clarity. The dead remind us that this world is passing away. I remember hearing about a young man who abandoned his faith completely after college. He mocked religion, mocked morality, mocked prayer. His life became centered entirely around pleasure, parties, relationships, money, status. Outwardly he appeared successful, but inwardly he was deeply restless. One night he dreamed of his grandfather who had died many years earlier. In the dream, his grandfather stood silently in an empty church. The young man asked, "Why are you here?" And the old man responded, "Because one day you will be here too." Then the dream ended. That sentence haunted him, not because it sounded dramatic, but because it pierced through every distraction he had built around himself. And psychologically, this makes profound sense. Human beings cannot permanently escape existential truth. Eventually the soul revolts against superficial living. A person can numb themselves temporarily with pleasure, entertainment, lust, success, substances, or noise. But eventually something inside begins crying out, "There must be more than this." That cry often emerges during suffering, during silence, during loss, or during dreams, especially dreams involving death, because death strips away illusion. When someone who has passed away appears in a dream, people are often forced to confront questions they spend years avoiding. What am I doing with my life? Am I spiritually prepared to die? Am I living truthfully? Am I becoming the person God created me to be? These questions terrify modern people because modern society worships comfort, not truth. People today are addicted to emotional anesthesia. Anything to avoid facing themselves honestly, but conscience cannot be silenced forever. If ignored long enough, it begins speaking through anxiety, emptiness, restlessness, and dreams. Many people today are spiritually asleep while physically awake. They go through routines mechanically. Wake up, work, consume, sleep, repeat, but there is no depth, no prayer, no reflection, no pursuit of holiness. And then suddenly a dream involving someone deceased shakes them awake emotionally. Why? Because the dead carry a reminder the world cannot erase. Life ends. One day your body will fail, your beauty will fade, your possessions will belong to someone else, your accomplishments will become dust. And then only one thing will matter, the condition of your soul. That is why these dreams often leave people feeling emotionally exposed. The dream breaks the illusion of permanence. People begin realizing how fragile life truly is. I once heard about a woman who repeatedly dreamed of her deceased sister during a period when she was living in serious moral compromise. She ignored prayer, ignored God, ignored conscience. In the dream, her sister simply stared at her with sadness. No words, just sadness. The woman woke up deeply disturbed every time. Now again, we must be careful. Not every dream is supernatural. Not every dream is a direct communication from heaven. But God can permit certain dreams to awaken the conscience. Scripture itself repeatedly shows God using dreams to warn, guide, and awaken. And psychologically, dreams can expose truths people suppress during waking life. In this woman's case, the dream forced her to confront something she desperately avoided. She was not at peace with herself. And many people today are not at peace because they are living divided lives. Outwardly, they smile. Internally, they feel empty. Outwardly, they appear confident. Internally, they are terrified of silence. Why? Because silence forces confrontation. When the noise stops, the soul begins asking dangerous questions. Why am I really unhappy? Why do I feel spiritually dead? Why do I feel distant from God? What am I becoming? Dreams involving deceased loved ones often intensify this confrontation because death represents finality. There comes a moment when earthly choices end. Modern culture hates this reality. It constantly promotes the fantasy that people can endlessly postpone moral responsibility. You have time, live however you want. Truth is subjective, follow your feelings, but death destroys those illusions instantly. At the moment of death, there are no more excuses, no more pretending, no more hiding behind public image. And the soul knows this instinctively. That is why some dreams involving the dead feel spiritually heavy. Not because the deceased are haunting the person, but because conscience is awakening them. The greatest danger in modern life is not suffering. It is spiritual numbness. A person can survive suffering, but when conscience becomes numb, the soul begins decaying silently. People stop recognizing sin, stop recognizing truth, stop recognizing God, and eventually they begin living only for temporary pleasure. But temporary pleasure cannot satisfy an eternal soul. This is why so many people today appear outwardly entertained, yet inwardly miserable. The human soul was created for God, and nothing less will ever fully satisfy it. Not money, not sex, not fame, not comfort, not distraction, nothing. That emptiness eventually surfaces, and sometimes dreams become the doorway through which the soul finally confronts reality. A dream involving the dead can become a moment of mercy, a spiritual interruption, a warning that life is passing quickly. People often assume mercy always feels comforting, but sometimes mercy disturbs you first. Sometimes mercy exposes the lie you are living. A person trapped in pride may need to feel shaken. A person drowning in distraction may need to feel awakened. A person spiritually asleep may need to feel uncomfortable, because comfort is not always love. Sometimes discomfort saves souls. Imagine a person standing near the edge of a cliff while blindfolded. Would love remain silent to avoid upsetting them? No, love warns, and many people who dream about deceased loved ones during periods of spiritual darkness experience precisely this kind of interior warning. Not terror, not condemnation, awakening, a realization that life is moving quickly and eternity is real. And perhaps that is why these dreams linger in the mind long after waking, because they touch something deeper than emotion. They touch destiny. You begin realizing, I will not live forever here. My choices matter. My soul matters. The way I live matters. And that realization can become the beginning of transformation. Many conversions begin with disruption. Not comfort, not convenience, disruption. Something breaks the cycle of superficial living, a death, a tragedy, a dream, a moment of silence, and suddenly the person begins seeing clearly for the first time in years. They return to prayer, return to confession, return to truth, return to God, not because they became emotionally weak, but because they finally became honest, honest about mortality, honest about sin, honest about emptiness, honest about the longing inside the human soul, and this honesty is the beginning of wisdom, because wisdom begins when a person stops living as though eternity is optional. So if you dream about someone who has passed away, do not immediately become obsessed with signs or mystical interpretations. Instead, ask yourself, what is this awakening inside me? What truth have I been avoiding? What part of my spiritual life has fallen asleep? What would happen if I died tonight? Those questions matter infinitely more than curiosity about the dream itself, because one day the dream will end. One day earthly life itself will end. And when that moment comes, the only thing that will matter is whether your soul belonged to God or to the world. So perhaps the greatest meaning behind these dreams is not that the dead are trying to return to us. Perhaps it is that God is trying to return us to himself, before time runs out, before conscience grows cold, before eternity arrives without warning.